Hi, it's me. Just want to remind you as we're going through these videos that there are a lot of things we're going to cover in this class that are controversial. There are a lot of things that scholars disagree with and disagree about. There are a lot of things that I'm going to talk about in these videos and that I'm going to present in class that I don't necessarily even agree with, but they are questions that you might want to consider, things that might help you to think about the text in a new way. And the videos are going to highlight specific points in particular texts that give you some things to think about, some questions to consider, some ways of thinking about or asking questions about the text that otherwise you might not have considered. That's all they are. So please know that there is no way that I would expect you to agree with me. I am not presenting these as the only way or the one correct way to look at the text. I am presenting them in an effort to be helpful and to give you things to think about and consider. If they're helpful to you, then that's great. Please consider the texts, think about them, consider the questions that I'm asking and the points that I'm raising. If they're not useful, then don't worry about it. There are plenty of other things that you've got to read and plenty of other things that you've got to do. So concentrate on them, and I hope that some of this somewhere is useful to you as we look at some really interesting texts and consider some really interesting questions. Thanks.
Hi, I'm outside today, so if there are a few extra nature sounds in the background, please try to ignore that. Today we're going to talk a little bit about Genesis chapter 3. I realize that it is quite common for us to read this text as a story in which Satan tempts the woman sins, the woman causes the man to sin, and then God steps in and punishes all three. Well, let's take a look at what the text actually says and think a little bit about what it is telling us. First of all, one thing that I would like for you to notice is that although it's quite common in Christian tradition and later on in the New Testament to associate the serpent with Satan, that's not actually what the book of Genesis itself says in chapter 3. In fact, the serpent here is just a plain old run-of-the-mill snake. There are three places in the Old Testament where the term Satan is used either as a title or in what might be construed as a personal name. One of those is in Job chapters 1 and 2. We'll get to that later in the course. Another is in Zechariah chapter 3, and again we'll get to that later in the course. And then the third is in 1 Chronicles chapter 21. Notice none of those are Genesis chapter 3. In fact, the text here just refers to the serpent as a serpent. Now, it is a symbol of wisdom, which is a little bit of satire against the human quest for wisdom. Because notice that when the man and the woman eat from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, what they are given is not some wonderful knowledge, some great wisdom that makes them like gods. It is a knowledge of their own nakedness and its sense of shame and embarrassment. So there's a little bit of satire going on there about the human desire to be wise and to be like gods. In fact, they don't get anything like that. But let's talk a little bit about what does happen. First of all, we often read this as the woman sins and then she brings the man along. But let's take a look at what the text actually says. If you notice in verse 6, it says, when the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate, and she also gave some to her husband who was with her. Whoa, wait a minute. What? Her husband who was with her. So, what is the man doing this whole time while the woman and the serpent are having a conversation about eating this fruit of this tree, which he has been told he should not eat? What's he doing? He's just standing there, not opening his mouth, not saying anything. It's a little hard to make a case that the woman was in the wrong and then brought the man along when they're both there. In fact, the rabbis, our Jewish forebears who wrote about this text in the time around the time of Jesus, actually said that the greater weight of guilt attached to the man, not the woman. And they said this for a couple of reasons. First of all, they said it because the man was the one who actually received the commandment. Now, we already talked in talking about chapters 1 and 2 that, one way of reading chapter 2 is that actually there's a sort of ungendered being that is then divided into man and woman, and that's the real completion of humankind. But the rabbis said that the man was the one who was given the commandment here. And so he's the one who's responsible for making sure that it is obeyed. And the other reason they said it had greater weight of sin for him was that if you look at what the woman says to the snake, she says, God says we should not eat of the fruit of the tree, nor should we touch it, lest we die. But that's not what God said. God says you can't eat of the fruit, because in the day in which you do, you will die. And so the rabbi said the man's guilt here was at least in part in that he put a fence around the Torah. The Torah, the commandment is, don't eat of the fruit of the tree. But in trying to make sure that you don't even get close to eating the fruit of the tree, he expanded the Torah, the commandment, to mean you can't even touch the fruit of the tree. And in putting a fence around the Torah, when the woman touched the fruit and saw that she didn't die, doubt crept into her mind. Well, is it really true? Will we die if we eat? I touched it and I didn't die. Will I also die then if I eat it? Maybe not. Now, that's kind of an imaginative retelling of the story that the rabbis had, but their point was that in adding to the commandment, there's the opportunity for sin to creep in. A couple of other things to note about this. We're very accustomed to reading this as punishment for sin. It's also possible to read this entirely as God simply communicating to the man and the woman what the consequences are of the actions that they have taken. They have done something that has now separated them from God, and there are consequences for that. And he announces what those consequences are. Also notice that one of those consequences is that the man and the woman who are created to be partners and essentially to be equals are now, as a result of the sin, going to be in a hierarchical relationship. It's funny how we in the church seem to want to persist in that hierarchical thinking, that men are supposed to be in charge and women are supposed to be subordinate. When what God says here is not that that's God's intention, that's a result of human sinfulness. That hierarchical thinking is what happens when sin creeps in. Think about that for a little while. Well, until next time.